I'm Francesca Nestor, Assistant Professor of Politics and Government. I'm co-director of the COVID-19 course along with Dr. Kira Bailey in Psychology and Neuroscience. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our third lecture in our series. Today, we will learn from Dr. Ellen Arnold, Associate Professor of History at Ohio Wesleyan. Dr. Arnold teaches ancient, medieval, and environmental history. Her current research project, Medieval Riverscapes, explores medieval attitudes toward rivers and water resources. Dr. Arnold just wrapped up the spring semester of her course on the Black Death. As a reminder, you can use the chat function to ask questions throughout the presentation. I will select a few for Dr. Arnold to answer if time permits. You can also continue your discussions on the COVID course Facebook group. And now, Pandemics of the Past with Dr. Ellen Arnold.
Hi, everybody. It's nice to see you in this virtual space. I see a couple of former students and a couple of people that I met at the Meet the Professors session last week. I am so happy to be back and continue to be a part of this interdisciplinary course on the COVID pandemic. My role today is to introduce some of the ideas and the questions that we can learn from studying history, from adding the historical perspective into our conversations about the medical, economic, cultural, and social transformations that we're facing in response to COVID. So I think that I want to start today, by letting the whole community see the discussion questions that I pose to our student learners. We have discussion questions every week for the students who are enrolled for credit. And I think that this is a good way of framing the kinds of examples that I'm going to show you and let you have in your head the kinds of big picture questions that I think are important when we're thinking about the role of disease in history and the role of environmental conditions as they impact and affect human cultures and human worlds. And so what I'm asking the students to think about more broadly beyond specific case studies is this idea of why might it matter to think about the pandemics and the epidemic diseases of the past, and what opportunities studying the past might bring us as contemporary citizens, but then to also bear in mind that the parallels across time are not always exact, and that there might be risks of looking to the past to guide our actions, and that we might make mistakes if we blindly assume that the lessons of the past can be simply applied to the sticky problems or the wicked problems of today. And so I invite you to keep those ideas in mind as I move through my examples for today. In the nature of time limits, I've decided to focus on 4 concrete examples of pandemic disease and to use them to just kind of introduce some of the different ways that we ask questions about disease in the past. I'm going to turn first to the less known incarnation of the Bubonic Plague in medieval history, the Justinianic Plague. I'm going to show you a bit about how it arrived on the scene and talk about how we look at the ways that geopolitics can shape the experience of pandemics. Also, going to introduce briefly this question that I talked about in the roundtable last week, this idea that one of the things that we can study about the past is look at the ways that people seek comfort and seek support in times of crisis. Then I'll turn to the more famous Black Death of 1347 and use that as a way to talk about the question of how massive crisis points ripple across communities. The ways that we as historians looking back on an event can see the footprint of that event on social, economic, and political systems. The ways that we, with the perspective of the really long term, hindsight, the ways that we can watch patterns of response. And then as a third case, I'm going to turn to cholera and look at these ideas of how it is that we establish our scientific understanding of diseases, how epidemic outbreaks and especially how pandemics can play a role in the radical transformation of scientific and cultural understandings of disease. And then finally, I will turn to a much more recent global pandemic that is still ongoing, the arrival of HIV/AIDS on the disease stage in the 1980s, and talk about the ways that we can look at the recent past to help us understand how modern societies respond to the same kinds of uncertainty that we're dealing and we're facing with now as we're watching an emerging disease develop and trying to figure it out. And I'll also use the HIV/AIDS example, which has been so swiftly evolving and transforming in our own lived experience, to look at briefly at the ways that historians focus not only on what happened, but also on the ways that we remember and talk about what happened with disasters and diseases. And so first, I want to turn to this pandemic disease that's known as the Justinianic plague. This disease took place in the years roughly 541 to 750 AD. This is a wave of bubonic plague that spread across the Eurasian territories. It's not really a continent. I got stuck for a word there for a second. It spread across Eurasia and really dramatically affected the development of multiple civilizations across the Mediterranean and the Near East. The reason that the Justinianic plague gives us opportunities to look at geopolitics is that the arrival of this particular set of plagues, it's all bubonic plague as far as we can tell right now from state-of-the-art archaeological science, but it occurs over several centuries. It occurs in wave after wave after wave of plague that never quite leaves the Mediterranean basin and Europe and the Near East for 200 years. This plague is called the Justinianic plague, even though it took place over multiple centuries, because of the name of the leader of the Byzantine Empire during its first arrival in Constantinople in 541, and that was Justinian, the builder of the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. Justinian stands out not only because he was the unfortunate ruler at the helm of a gigantic wave of pandemic disease, but also because he was also at the helm of a large army that was aimed at reconquering the former Roman Empire. And so on this map that you're looking at, the purple is the areas that he had control of when he took the throne in 527, and the orange areas are areas that he added through military conquest throughout his reign. And so he moved people and armies all across the Mediterranean to try to reconquer the former Roman Empire. And as Dr. Anderson pointed out in her lecture last week, one of the things that tends to facilitate the transmission of many animal to human diseases, and the bubonic plague is a complicated vector of animal to human disease involving rodents and other animals and fleas and humans, that the disruption caused by mass human movements across large spaces like military mobilization, and the disturbances to environment and landscape caused by armies and military battles facilitates plague. And so we watch as Justinian inadvertently, through his geopolitical ambitions, lays the groundwork for this plague to spread very quickly throughout what was then the known world. This plague is also geopolitically important because it reminds us that it's not only through military conquest that plague spreads, but it's also through the processes that lead to the formations of empire and the consolidation of political power. And so following the Justinian's reign for a period of about 250 years, almost the same time period that the Justinianic plague is in Europe, we see the consolidation of a new large-scale kingdom uniting a bunch of separate divided areas under the what we now call the Merovingian kingdoms, and so the consolidation of political power, the sewing together of travel routes, of trade, of political entities, the easing of tensions along borders also facilitates the movement of humans and the spread of disease. And finally, this period is really fascinating geopolitically because the final stages of the Justinianic plague waves correspond with the rise of Islam and the life and rise of Muhammad, and then his successors. The first four caliphs is in the lighter orange, and then by the later stages of the Justinianic plague, this purple territory is all territory militarily and culturally conquered by the new geopolitical forces led by the caliphs in charge of the new religious and cultural communities of Islam. And so you'll notice that some of that is the same areas that Justinian had conquered. And so we see a second wave of massive troop migrations. And we also see the Islamic territories moving into taking over some of the larger ancient empire territories. And so further connecting the Mediterranean with the Middle East and the Eurasian steppes, which exaggerates the pandemic nature of the bubonic plague. And so what could have potentially been outbreaks of epidemic disease because of all of the geopolitical movement of peoples, both through military and through the consolidation process and the growth of new polities, of new communities, we see these human political decisions, meaning that the ability for disease to spread is just so much greater than it would otherwise have been. And so we see not only the joining up of the environmental and animal and disease ecology aspects of pandemic disease, but we really see in this outbreak all the ways that human politics and human community decisions and geopolitical power can play a role in disease spreading. And I promised that I would also talk a bit about where people look for help and for solace. And I think one of the other interesting things that we have to pay attention to when we look at the history of the Justinianic plague is not just how it spread across the world, but the fact that it spread into a world that was into several different worlds: Byzantium, the Merovingian Frankish kingdom, and the newly emerging Islamic communities that were facing identity crisis points, that were adapting to new lands, and were adopting new religions. Because this same time period that sees the rise of the Merovingian kings and the creation of this political community also saw the deepening of conversion to Christianity in most of what we think of as modern Europe. And obviously also the rise of the Islamic faith corresponded with the rise of the Islamic caliphates. And so we have people seeking out not only political identities, but we have people adapting to new religious communities. And so as the plague hits, people throughout the Mediterranean world and throughout the Middle East are turning to political leaders. They're turning to their increasingly important communities of faith, and they're looking to in some cases, relatively new faith communities to find answers and support in a time of crisis. But then they're also building on their older identities, building on the older identities that Justinian was invoking when he tried to reconquer the Roman Empire. And so the ancient Greek and ancient Roman medicine, the scientific experts of the classical past, become another point at which many of the community leaders turn for help and support. And so we have people seeking out political and community experts. To build again on this first conversation, we have people seeking out academic medical experts, and we have people seeking out experts from their faith communities. And so as historians, it's really interesting for us to see the ways in which all of those experts were turned to, and all of those experts both met the expectations of their communities and failed to stop the plague. And so as we look at a plague, because now we know it is a bacterium and would have needed antibiotics to actually treat it, and those were clearly not developed in this time period, nothing those experts could do would actually work in the face of these outbreaks. But we see the complexities of the ways people sought help. To add a bit of ancient voice into this conversation, I pulled out what is to me one of the more powerful explanations of what this outbreak felt like on the ground to the people experiencing it. This is in the words of Paul the Deacon, who was writing a history of the Lombard peoples, so a history of the Germanic peoples who really kind of took over some of the power of Italy from the fading Roman Empire. And he describes this outbreak in the year 565 in ways that I think resonate with some of our own experiences of this current pandemic. He notes the absences, the vacancies, the quiet cities, the places without commerce, the public places that had lately been filled with crowds of men, but on the next day all had departed and everything was in utter silence. You might see, he writes, the world brought back to its ancient silence. And this line has always struck me, but I think that it's even more powerful now, having spent time listening to the silence around my house and sadly the silence on campus, the sense of the way in which disease muffles human activity. It muffles life and action. Luckily, again, as I said last week, luckily for us, this is because we are all staying indoors and staying safe, not because we have all died. But I think this voice from the past is another reminder that this is not an experience that we have to go through completely alone. That one of the ways we can seek support beyond our political leaders, beyond our church communities, beyond medical experts, is we can actually look to the voices and experiences of people who have lived through such tragedies and ruptures before. Unfortunately for Europe, this was not the only time they would experience the bubonic plague. Many of you, if you knew only one historical pandemic, you know the Black Death. The Black Death was a wave of bubonic plague that reached Europe via the Mongol Empire and trade and war connections that the Mongols established with opening up new trade routes and building a giant empire. And it was both through a combination of trade and mercantile connections and the wages of war that the bubonic plague outbreak that started through a disruption of rodent communities in the Mongolian steppe reached not only as far as China, but reached all the way to the most isolated parts of Europe, in the British Isles within the span of 4 years. This is one of the best modern imaginings of the mapping of disease based on written records, archaeological evidence, and medical knowledge about how bubonic plague spreads. And the thing that always jumps out to me when I look at this particular map is the almost inevitability of the spread of plague once it hit those red dots of the powerful Italian trading cities of the late Middle Ages. And having watched as COVID really hit Italy terribly hard through Italian ports, through Italian airport cities, through the big population concentrations of Italy, watching it happen again and slowly then moving out of Italy into Germany, into Spain, across the Alps, into France and Scandinavia and Britain, watching the rest of Europe watch Italy get sick reminded me of what it must have felt like for the people in the 14th century to slowly hear rumors of everyone in Italy getting sick. And knowing that this was coming, and knowing it was coming fast, and knowing that there was really nothing that they could effectively do against it. That didn't stop them from trying. There are lots of attempts by many smart, talented, brave people in medieval Europe to deal with this coming plague, but they couldn't stop it. And from the perspective of England, which doesn't really get the bulk of its cases until 1349, they've had 2.5 years to watch everyone else get sick. And so watching this disease coming, realizing how bad it was, and knowing there wasn't much you could do about it, was an experience that I had hoped up until now would be something that would be necessary for my students to imagine and be creative about. Unfortunately, we're now experiencing some of those same patterns of witnessing history as it happens. Why is the Black Death the most popular of these diseases, though? Why is the Black Death the best known of these diseases? And what can it teach us as historians, or what can it teach us today, since we have bubonic plague all over the place now, and it's not really a big deal because we have antibiotic treatments and very few people die from bubonic plague anymore. And so why should we pay attention to the Black Death? Why does this moment in medieval history matter to our understandings of how disease works in the world? Unfortunately for medieval Europeans, part of the answer to this lies in the absolute devastation of this disease. I'm going to start this conversation with a single voice, that of Petrarch, the famous Renaissance scholar and teacher, a single voice that captures the absences of all of the other voices that used to surround him. The Black Death, it's very hard to do demographic analysis of medieval populations. It's a very tricky, delicate, complicated thing that involves not only awareness of the ways in which medieval evidence is produced, but then also awareness of the mathematics behind demographic life tables and demographic patterns. But it is clear, no matter how we look at the really complicated sets of evidence about medieval population, that many, 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 many people died. Some of the Italian city-states, and Petrarch is writing about an experience in that region, lost up to 70% of the urban communities. This was a devastating disease that more than decimated communities. In many cases, 50 to 80% of small villages were lost. 50 to 70% of urban communities died in the first onslaught of plague. Tax evidence shows us that some communities, 40% of taxpayers were no longer there from one year to the next. All of the communities throughout Europe, urban and rural, suffered a sudden, violent, painful, tragic, largely unanticipated until a few years before it happened, loss. Where are our dear friends now? Where are our beloved faces? Where are the affectionate words? By the time he goes through all of these tragedies and disasters that may have killed them, but his readers, of course, know that it was the disease that did so, he simply is defeated. There was a crowd of us, now we are almost alone. We should make new friends, but how when the human race is almost wiped out? This may seem like the exaggeration of a poet, but every way we look at the demography and the evidence of death in the medieval world, we see a completely distraught and empty place, with people trying to do their best to hold together the strings of society. What I've got here is a set of, an example of how it is that medieval scholars figure out what happened in the plague. This is from one small community in England, and they have records from the local courts that go and figure out who pays the death taxes and the fees and fines for taking church office and taking up new landholding obligations. And you could pick any of these little paragraphs, read it, and see that the vacancies of church offices, the vacancies of death is hitting all of these vicarages, that the church is struck by the loss of the people to run it. And include the vicarage of Garston here was vacant twice during the time. But then they moved from the individual vicarages down to looking at the deaths in the parishes. And this rather unexceptional, rather straightforward, not at all poetic account of death fines and bureaucracy suggests that 3,000 men and women died in a single parish. 300 of them made wills. This becomes important for the bureaucracy, so they take note of it. And then it goes on to list the 300 people who left wills and what their wills said. And so just this tiny part of England not only loses much of its religious leadership, but within individual parishes, thousands of villagers, many of whom never get recorded in the historical record at all. 300 of whom make wills, and so they and their fates wind up recorded. It's hard for us right now in COVID to figure out how many people are sick and how many people have died from it. It's incredibly hard for us to go back and reconstruct this in the past in a world without the kinds of modern bureaucracy that we have. That said, people have tried. This is a model of potentially what the population of England was between the years 850 and 1550. And let me try to see if I can, there is my pointer. You'll see here that actually for most of the experience of the Middle Ages, and this right here is the period that I personally research, population stays pretty level. Medieval England, with the economy and agricultural and social and demographic systems of the Middle Ages, is relatively around 2 million people for hundreds of years. Then an enormous period of growth takes place that's due to climate and economy and trade and all sorts of complicated, fascinating convergences of ideal conditions for growing crops and growing populations in medieval Europe. And you can see the population of medieval Europe between 1150 and 1300 just becomes enormous. And we have this entire infrastructure that's redefined and rebuilt to support this booming population. Then you see this drop off. You might think, that's the plague. In fact, that drop off, the bottom peak is right here, is not the Black Death. That drop off is a comparatively minor crisis known as the Great Famine. And so the plague was preceded by 3 years of famine throughout Europe, killing hundreds of thousands of people in England alone. And the population started to recover. This is what the plague did. In the course of 1 year in England, the population went from around 5 million people back to the levels that it was at before the exponential growth of population in the 1100s. This was a catastrophe. The Black Death throughout Europe decimated human populations, and in a Europe that had adapted itself to a higher population, emptied out the infrastructure. The world stopped functioning. This was a world built to support, in England, for example, over 5 million people, and suddenly there's only 2 million people to run it. This is an unbelievable, unimaginable shock to the system. And it transforms agriculture, it transforms the economy, it transforms politics, it transforms relationships between communities and the church. It transforms relationships between regional and local churches and the broader Christian community. It transforms family structures. Everyone in Europe would have known someone who died. That severity of impact lets us as historians recognize just how powerful exogenous forces like emergent diseases can be in shaping human history. It also suggests, however, how resilient human populations can be, because here's the plague. England recovered. What's crazy about thinking comparatively about disease, though, when we're talking about numbers, is the fact that the point at which England experienced the plague, well, look how many people live in the United Kingdom now. When we're looking from a modern perspective back at these historical diseases, it's so weird because the losses that would have crippled the medieval or ancient economies would be a kind of a blip in our own demography. And so one of the big problems working backwards across time is readjusting our scales and really working to understand the scale and the context of the moment in which diseases hit, and recognizing, as we would with pricing or any other kind of quantitative attempt to measure the past, that the numbers that we talk about now are going to be radically different than the numbers that we talk about in the Black Death. But if we bear in mind the relative size of communities, and if we bear in mind that every single loss to disease, as I mentioned last week, was a loss of a person and a loss to a family, a loss to a local economy, a loss to a community, that's part of how we can see past the numerical dissonance between what it means to lose 2 million people in 1348 to what it means to lose 2 million people in 2020. Every single person matters. Every single loss is part of the ways in which the ripple effects of these diseases will be felt, and the ways in which communities will have to build resilience up. Black Death is where I spend most of my teaching time, but I want to end with two other examples that are probably familiar to you to help us tie this distant past a little more tightly to our present. Cholera is in many ways a disease that is directly related to the rising populations of England. In fact, I'm going to go back a slide for a second. If you look at what happens right around 1800, that's a start of a rise that's similar in degree to the rise that I showed you here. Around 1800, we really start to see urban density in England take off. And this enormous population boom in cities creates a whole lot more people using a lot of human waste. And cholera is a disease associated with human waste, with fecal matter. And as cities grew beyond the size that the infrastructure allowed for, and beyond the size that the natural treatment abilities of flowing water could no longer take care of, then we start to wind up with water supplies that get infected. And throughout the 1800s, we see waves and waves and waves of cholera throughout the world. It's not only in England. There's an outbreak of cholera in 1817 in India, in 1823 in Russia. The UK saw a 1, 2, 3 hit of an outbreak in 1831, an outbreak in 1848 to 1849 that killed 50 to 70,000 people, and then an outbreak in 1854 that left 30,000 dead in London alone. Now, if you've been reading this post as I've been talking, this newspaper, this flyer, you've probably seen some things that both sound like good health advice, like stay warm, stay out of the draft, attend immediately to all disorders of the bowels. That sounds like things we would advise people today to kind of take care of. What's interesting about this advice, however, is it's not rooted in our same modern medicine. It's rooted in medieval and ancient ideas about the four bodily humors. Cholera was believed to be caused by miasma, by bad air that was contagious, that spread bad air around the community, and that people who were weak, people who were unhealthy, people whose humors were unbalanced were more likely to be susceptible to that bad air. And so you should avoid raw vegetables. You should, because cholera is a disease that is wet and cold, you should not expose yourself to cold water, because that would make you more cold and more wet and therefore more likely to succumb to cholera. And so you should also sleep warm. You should not sleep in a draft. You should stay hot, so that if this bad air imbalances you, you're already a little too warm, and so you're less likely to get sick. This seems really unusual to us. But by the 1800s, this was 2 millennia of medical expertise and medical knowledge. The idea that the individual body's constitution could be regulated and understood through diet, through atmosphere, through climate, and through the regulating of body temperature was established truth. It was medical. It was taken for granted by medical experts and scientists. It is the course of the experience of cholera that begins to radically transform medical theory and medical knowledge to to the systems that we are now part of, in which germ theory is the dominant explanation rather than individual humors. It was, the microscope had already been discovered, people had already found microbes, people had found bacteria and found out about some of these microbial processes and knew that there were all of these things that lived in water, but no one had made the link firmly and conclusively between these little animalcules and disease. It was with the spread of cholera and the devastation that cholera brought. And here's a handwritten example of the bureaucratic death logs of London in the 1800s. And you see how many people of the dead are dying of cholera, that these outbreaks really garner the attention of scientists, the attention of public health officials, the attention of doctors, and people really want to figure out why these outbreaks are happening so often and so fast, and what is wrong that is leading to the miasma. It is over the course of the investigation of one of the cholera outbreaks in London that Dr. Snow, don't want to accidentally mix up my disease history and my fantasy reading, I think though it's John Snow, is able to map the outbreak of cholera. And this is his famous map. And these little boxes are people who die of cholera. In each household, he goes around and does a survey, almost like contact tracing now, and realizes that this density here of deaths may be related to the geographical location. And as he starts going and doing interviews with these communities and these families and these households, he starts to realize the one thing all of these households and the workhouse have in common is that they draw their water from the same pump on Broad Street. And so this convinces him that this is a waterborne illness. This convinces him and many of his supporters that something is happening beyond airborne contagion to lead to disease. And it eventually leads to a giant series of arguments and debates within the National Academy of Medicine about the nature of cholera and the nature of disease. And it becomes one of the linchpins in the very slow and traumatic shift of medical paradigm away from contagious air and bodily humors to exposure to contagious substances. And it is with this outbreak of cholera that we start the really rather long transformation away from a 2,000-year-old medical understanding of the world to a new paradigm about how medicine and the human body works. And we're now only several hundred years into our new paradigm of how medicine works. And it may be that another round of pandemic disease proves to be the spark for a new transformation of medical knowledge and our understandings of viruses and the relationship between viruses in human societies. The final example I want to point out is the continuing ongoing global pandemic of AIDS. This case study is important because it reminds us that COVID is not the first time in our own lived experience for many people that we have dealt with uncertainty about the causes of disease, where we have watched an unknown, unexplained disease arrive, take root, work its way epidemiologically through communities, and be a force by which we not only watch medical experts wrestle with uncertainty, but we are able to watch, because of the nature of photography and television and our own lived experience, we're able to watch how communities and non-experts cope and live with uncertainty and who they turn to for support and help and advice. And so the HIV/AIDS epidemic reminds us that fear is expected, reminds us that research is demanded, that public exposure and, exposure is the wrong word, public awareness is driven by not only knowing people immediately affected by disease, but now by the 20th century is also tied to the media and to press, and that this both provides comfort and knowledge to many people, but that it also increases people's awareness of uncertainty, that it increases fear, it increases worry, along with increasing and speeding up the spread of information when it is available. The HIV/AIDS pandemic also shows us that pouring money and political will into research can yield results. However, that those results can take a long time to be affordable, to be accessible, that the dialogues and discourses around disease and sickness can often prevent people from seeking treatment, can prevent people from receiving treatment, and can slow recovery. And so the HIV/AIDS crisis reminds us that transparency in the quest for dealing with uncertainty is important. Here you can see this dark line is diagnosed cases of HIV/AIDS, and this dashed line is deaths from HIV/AIDS. And this is when testing expands. This is when retroviral and antiretroviral therapy is developed and the deaths drop off. And the new diagnosis drops off as we understand the disease, but we also see more and more people living with AIDS diagnoses and it becoming an endemic disease, something that is just generally part of our communities. In the long run, it seems to be working. The number of AIDS-related deaths has plummeted around the world. What is interesting about this particular pandemic is that though it is ongoing, we are already wrestling with how we as a community remember and think about it. And I will end with this image, which is of the AIDS memorial quilt, which started out as a plea for government attention, that started out as an argument for increasing research, destigmatizing death by AIDS. It started out as an activist intervention into driving public awareness, public funding, and destigmatizing HIV/AIDS. And since the success of those efforts has now been converted into a memorial for remembering the peak mortality era of HIV/AIDS in the 90s. So we can watch historical memory change in our own lived experience. And this AIDS quilt and other stories and cultural artifacts of the AIDS pandemic make us as historians and current citizens pause and think, what is the power of remembering the past? What is the power of being aware of the potency of disease and the ways that experiencing, surviving, and resiliently recovering from pandemics can not only shape our societies, could and should be remembered in the stories that we tell about ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Arnold. That was wonderful. We have 10 minutes for your questions. You'll be happy to know that 2 of your viewers have shared that it was Dr. John Snow.
Yay!
Apparently, apparently he was in an episode of PBS masterpiece Victoria, so he's fairly well known. So as you know, probably the pandemics has been talked about a lot in relation to the current one is the so-called Spanish flu.
Yes.
We have someone questioning how that compares with the loss in other pandemics that you discussed.
It's hard, not as bad as the Black Death, much worse than us so far, than COVID so far. I am not a demographer, so I don't really have that sense of numbers at the tip of my tongue, unfortunately. One of the things that I think is interesting in terms of scale of disaster is how little we remember the 1918 pandemic. We've been talking about it lately, but until really about 15 years ago, it wasn't even mentioned in textbooks. It was a forgotten pandemic, which suggests that its impact is not as long-lived as some of these other diseases, even though tens of thousands of people died from it. And Professor Flam and I were actually having a conversation about this a couple of weeks ago, who's the modern American historian here at OVU, about why that might be. And it's not because it wasn't devastating. It's not because it wasn't bad. It's not because tens of thousands of people didn't die from it. It's because there was also a world war happening. And there were lots of reasons that people in their 20s and 30s were dying. And the lost generation that is so famous in conversations about World War I is also lost because it died of flu. And so it was this combination of human disaster and disease that wiped out a giant swath of the world's youth. And it didn't really get remembered in that same way because there was a much more interesting thing to remember, a much more heroic thing to remember, which was war.
That's very true. You spoke somewhat to the ways that things change after these sorts of things occur. And we've had a couple people asking questions along those lines. Questions about how did healthcare change?
Yeah.
How did political structures change after the cholera epidemics? And then also, how did social life change? How did the economy change after these pandemics?
The healthcare out of cholera is really interesting because it's in the wake of the understanding of the cholera disease dynamics that we get major investment in public sanitation works, and that we get major investment in urban water infrastructure. And that's one of the most transformative aspects of cholera, and understanding the waterborne nature of cholera is it leads to a radical transformation of the degree of investment in urban health infrastructure and in urban water supplies. And that is still one of the leading battlegrounds, bad battle metaphor, but that's still one of the leading edges of modern public health, is providing and ensuring stable and safe and secure drinking water. That's the attention to the provision of safe and clean drinking water is a direct result of figuring out cholera. As is eventually the shift of mindset of scientific paradigm to germ theory. That's the biggest transformation that comes out of the 1800s. The other major moment that we can see of transformation of disease and public health is related to another pandemic that I didn't have time to talk about. There's so many of them, and that is the rise of smallpox cases around the world. And that is tied to the colonialism of the Americas by Europeans who brought cowpox and smallpox with them to completely previously unexposed populations. But then the increase of smallpox in the Americas contributed to continuing rise of smallpox cases back in Europe as well. And it became a reciprocal disease loop of contagion. And it was severe enough and deadly enough that it became one of the focal points of the development of vaccines and vaccination. And so in many ways, it's the smallpox virus that and its devastating impact on the Americas and its continued deadly presence as an endemic disease throughout Europe that triggers the really radical health transformation of the development of vaccines, and along with germ theory.
Can you speak to how stigma and bias might have played into past pandemics? Because we're seeing that a lot with COVID-19.
Yeah, this is one of the things that disease scholars really spend a lot of time trying to assess. Is one of the things that historians add to the mix. And disease history is written by historians, it's written by epidemiologists, it's written by demographers. It's it is an inherently interdisciplinary process. A lot of our modern disease history relies on microbiologists and archaeologists to do analysis of dental pulp of skeletons in graveyards, right? It's inherently interdisciplinary. The thing that the humanists in historical fields add and contribute, and one of the things that we feel proudest about in our contribution to this, is looking at those things that are cultural, looking at not only the questions of scientific paradigm shift, but these questions of human weaknesses and prejudices and biases and the patterns of human persecutions of others. This is something that historically we see as new fears and new dangers arise in communities. Communities both hunker down and lash out. And we are seeing this in our own reactions to COVID. You see historically groups becoming cohesive, creating and extending circles and communities of care. And you see groups exiling the sick. You see groups banishing the ill. There's a long history of this with leprosy in European history, of banishing the leprous, exiling and excising the sick from communities. In a worldview in which health and morality are linked, and disease and divine punishment are connected. And that's been true for most of human history. And I would argue still very much part of many people's response to illness. You think about people who say, well, some of these debates about health insurance, and well, if people didn't eat bad food, they wouldn't have diabetes and they wouldn't be sick. This idea of linking illness with moral failings is long, and it's deep rooted. And the idea that in a case of pandemic or epidemic, when a new disease emerges or an old disease suddenly flares up, we see these moments in which it's comforting to be able to say, well, it won't be me because I'm good. And then the idea that if you banish those who are bad, and that is a cultural construct, that you will somehow protect your community. And so we see in countless epidemic diseases, not only the tremendous outpouring of love and support and kindness and care and compassion for people within communities, but we also see an increased attempt to protect communities from people that one believes are amoral or immoral or bad or polluted. And that's how we get into connections of disease and anti-Semitism, disease and religious persecution. Some of the problems of persecution of gay communities and the rise of the awareness of the spread of HIV/AIDS. That this is a long old problem that we haven't solved, and that we need to be aware of, just as we are watching for fevers and dry coughs and tracking our physical symptoms to be aware of the potential that we are catching COVID. We need to kind of also be on guard for our cultural symptoms of othering and protecting our loved ones at the expense of potentially shunning and hurting and demonizing other people.
Absolutely. We have some folks asking questions about what materials they can turn to learn more.
Uh-huh.
And we have some folks chiming in with some different ideas. So I'll say to them that we have our Facebook discussion page, and that seems like a prime place where those can be shared, and you can share them as well.
Yes.
As we close, I just want to ask you one final question, and
Okay.
that is, yes.
Also going to say that as soon as my grades are submitted, I'm going to be putting together a reading list of easily available popular history books on the subject that are going to be good entry points.
Excellent. Okay.
But once grades are done.
Yes. So one last question is related to one earlier. Is our world going to be the same, or have we changed forever?
We always change forever. One of the most popular sayings about history is that history repeats itself, but history never repeats itself. History is the study of the way that human societies change in response to stimulus. One of my favorite explanations of history here, I'm going to draw this real fast because the people who are here from science backgrounds will appreciate it. My favorite definition of history comes from one of my undergraduate professors, which is simply history is the study of change over time and the analysis of why it happened and what it means. And so we are absolutely going to change as a result of this. It's up to us as communities, as citizens, as voters, as people living in this world, this environment, this community, to determine the shape of how we change. History is also always a reminder that people are swept along by forces, but that people also make decisions in ways that add up and stack up to communal level change. History is very rarely the result of decisions made by single powerful people. It's the result of hundreds and thousands of people making decisions about their lives, their lifestyles, their actions, their communities. And so we will change. It is inevitable. The question becomes, and this is what a lot of my colleagues are going to be talking about in the coming weeks, is how we put ourselves in a position to where when in 100 years, historians are looking back at us saying, wow, they made some really smart decisions about how to be resilient in the face of this crisis.
Thank you, Dr. Arnold, for sharing your time and your knowledge with us. And thank you to the audience for being here and asking such amazing questions. And don't forget that we have the Facebook conversation happening. Another way you can join in is to join the Meet the Profs discussion sessions. For students, that's Thursday at 4 p.m. in Blackboard Collaborate. And community members can join us at noon on Friday. And there will be RSVP links provided. If you have any questions in the meantime, contact COVID class coordinator at owu.edu, and we will see you on Wednesday at 4 for Modeling COVID-19, a discussion with Dr. Barbara Anderek and Dr. Heather Fair. Thank you all so much.